Okay, so now we are officially recording, and again, my name is Brian Gum. I may not have already introduced myself, but I'm Brian Gum, and I'm the Distance Learning Technology Analyst for Eastern Mennonite University. I am also a former student of Howard, so this is always a really fun part of my job to continue working with Howard, one of my former teachers, and he continues to be a mentor to me. As in addition to being a technology person, I'm also a peace building educator. Periodically teach courses on conflict transformation and restorative justice, and so it's fun to be a techie with Howard, but it's also fun to keep learning from him, and especially through this webinar series. So without further ado, I'll turn things over to Howard, and we'll get going with our topic of conversation today. Howard?
Thank you, Brian, and greetings to all of you. Thanks for joining us. I'll add my welcome to Brian's words. Yes, we do record these, and they should be available online later if you missed it or if you want to hear it again or share it with other people. This is the last of our series for this fall, but we have another series starting in January, and at the end, Sarah will tell you what's planned for those. Today, our guest is Harley Eagle, and I'm really pleased that he's here with us. Here you see on the screen some of the details about Harley. His current work is he's a coordinator of Indigenous Work with Mennonite Central Committee. He's a longtime restorative justice and conflict resolution practitioner. I first learned to know him and his wife when they were at Pine Ridge in the mid-90s. And have enjoyed having contact with him from time to time since that time. So I'm looking forward to this conversation with this interesting topic, the paradox of being an Indigenous justice practitioner. Harley, I'd like you to introduce yourself however you'd like to do it, and I'm particularly interested in knowing what are the cultural and personal parts of your background that really shape and inform what you do. Could you tell us something about yourself?
Sure. Well, good afternoon to everybody, and thanks for being a part of this webinar. And I see that there's some friends on the call, so thank you for joining. Once again, my name is Harley Eagle, and I was born and raised for the most part in Saskatchewan, Canada. My father is Dakota, and my mother is Ojibwe. That's, these days as I explore and understand more and more about my identity and also the history of Canada and the U.S. and the whole context of colonization, a question like you asked, Howard, becomes more and more difficult for me to answer. Because I recognize the dynamics of history in my life and can see how it has played out, things that have happened hundreds of years ago and have influenced the way that I think and the way that I interact in the world. And consequently, there's things that I need to undo in my life because of those experiences. But maybe a short answer is, I first got involved with restorative justice actually through my wife, who is of Mennonite descent, and she's the one that first told me about this thing called restorative justice and the victim-offender mediation process. And when I first heard about it, I thought it was probably one of the craziest ideas that I'd ever heard. My opinion was that offenders needed to serve their time. They needed to pay their consequences by going to jail or whatever it was. I had enough influence from the mainstream society that's what it told me. That's what I had learned was appropriate. But as I began to understand it a little more, I started to realize that this was something that made sense. And then when I made the connection to the fact that this is an old process that speaks to who I am as an Indigenous person, then it made a lot of sense. And I found myself quite attracted to the process, and I found I think I had some natural skills. I think I've been a fairly good listener. for most of my life, and even as a child, as a young person, I played the role often of a mediator between friends and family. So it spoke to me at a lot of levels, but mainly when I understood that it was a part of my identity as an Indigenous person, it made a lot more sense and something that I felt that I could do and was called on by community members to actually be involved in facilitating processes.
Well, interesting. Well, we're going to talk a little later about any kind of tensions you may have around that, but how do you articulate it? I mean, if you're asked to articulate restorative justice, or at least the philosophy around that, how do you do it? How do you talk about it?
I talk about it as that it's dealing with conflict or dealing with situations that have been hurtful. You can't just deal with what's on the surface. You have to get underneath to figure out why these things happened. What is it about the story that isn't being told? How can we go deeper to figure out what's the root cause of the situation and work at it from that level? And so when you say that to people, they say, yeah, that makes a lot of sense, because I don't want this to happen again. And I want to understand why this happened to me. So this makes a lot of sense. And if you see on the screen there that Howard's put up the medicine wheel, it's an Indigenous way of seeing life, and it comes from a specific group of people, and mostly from the plains area of North America. So I want to make that clear that this is just one way of looking, one lens, Indigenous lens of seeing life. There's many different ways from Indigenous people all over the world that have different ways of expressing life. In this particular circle, it's talking about balance. It's talking about that we as human beings have 4 quadrants to who we are. We're spiritual beings. We're emotional. We're physical, and we're intellectual beings, and we need to tend to each of those areas in order to walk a balanced life. And why I wanted to show this picture is because it really is about movement. It's about flow. It's about a process. It's about a way of doing life, of experiencing life, and it mimics what I've found is the restorative process, or a victim offender mediation process. So many different processes in the restorative world follow the same pattern of, in the spiritual quadrant, we talk about setting the tone, that it's important to come together in a certain way that's helpful for helping people to be ready to deal with a difficult situation. And then you move to the next quadrant, which is the emotional, where you hear the story. You hear all the stories that are involved. And then moving to the third quadrant, the physical, that's where you begin to dig deeper. And the way I think about the physical quadrant is that it's relational. It's trying to understand. It's trying to put together the threads. It's trying to dig deep and figure out how things are connected. And it's only when you follow those 3 steps, or follow that process, that you can move to that's the intellectual. So what are we going to do about it? What are the decisions we're going to make on how to deal with this situation? So I like using that, because for me, in my experience of working in restorative justice and conflict resolution, I think just about every process follows that flow, and it really mimics I guess a more natural way of being in the world. Yeah.
And I presume it's a reminder of how we who try to do this work need to have address all of those quadrants in our own lives.
Mm-hmm. Yeah, absolutely. And we'll be talking a little bit later about that. But it's if you don't understand this as a facilitator and fail to realize that this is something that I kind of have to hold up as a mirror in front of me and figure out how I'm doing within this setting, then you're going to end up, I guess, maybe not being the best facilitator that you could be if you're not aware of your own dynamics and the areas that you need to address. If you do, it makes you a better facilitator. That's for sure.
I remember Rosemary Rowlands, who you probably know. from Yukon area, when she taught here, she would talk about the fact that when so-called offenders came into the circle, they were asked to address all four of those quadrants in their own lives as well.
Yeah.
You want to move on to the next slide here?
So I wanted this slide to be put in. It's in the background. You can see the medicine wheel, and it's in the background. There's the globe, the earth, water, and land. And I really like this picture. It's a friend of mine, Jim Yellowhawk, drew this as a logo for an organization that I was a part of called the Indigenous Issues Forums. And he and his wife and I worked together and another colleague for many years, conducting circles and using this process to engage with difficult issues, difficult conversations, and with conflict. One of the things that we often talked about doing is asking him to make the woman in here pregnant to recognize future generations. And it's important to have, for me as a male, to have the woman be a part of this logo. It's reflective of what I would call the genius and brilliance of femininity. And it's sad to say that in this modern society, I would say that we as men, we're not taught how to nurture our own femininity, and I would say that sexism is rampant in this world. So it's a way of recognizing the importance of taking direction from women and to recognize the femininity that's all around us in this world. And we kind of need to highlight that and to put a spotlight on that, and to especially for we as men, to figure out what that all means. What does it mean to be raised in a sexist world as a man? And then how do you appropriately take direction from women in addressing every aspect of our lives?
All right. You ready for the next one?
Sure. So this is also some art by my friend Jim Yellowhawk. The reason why I wanted to put this here is that this forum that he's using, or this way of doing art, is called ledger art. And ledger art is referencing, you can see in the background of the picture, lines and words and numbers. So this art is drawn on old ledger, used ledger paper. So this comes from back in the day when Native people were being put onto reservations and forced onto reservations and losing access to their land, and dealing with that whole terrible part of the history of this land, and being put onto reservations, or as they're often called, prisoner of war camps, where they were confined. They no longer had access to their traditional artistic mediums, like just the way that they used to do their art, and they used to do it on hides, buffalo hides, and what have you. And so what happened was they asked for a way of being able to do art, or to express themselves, or to capture the history and capture what is happening to them, or to remember things in the past. And so some of the prison guards gave them old ledger paper. And so that's where they started to draw their pictures on. And so back in the 70s and 80s, some Native American artists revived this, or they saw, they had old pictures of ledger art, so they revived this way of doing art. And Jim Yellowhawk is one of the artists that does this. But for me, it expresses something else. It expresses that we live in a context of colonialism, that colonialism hasn't gone away for all of us, and certainly in the eyes and perspective of many Native American people, that we're still dealing with this old conflict, this old colonial aspect of everyday life. It's alive and well. I mean, we still have reservations. We still have apartheid here in North America with reservations. with Indian reservations. And so this to me expresses that, if you think about that context as the ledger in the background, so we live in that context, but we can choose and we can try to bring forward or to blow the dust off of, or however you want to say it, the genius and brilliance of Indigenous ways. And I would say that restorative justice is one of those ways that has, most people recognize that restorative justice has its roots in Indigenous ways from all over the world. And so this is, for me, an expression of that the beauty and the genius and brilliance of a restorative way is overlaid on the context of a colonial way of life that's still with us to this day.
And so that has, this colonial context that we still find ourselves in has implications for restorative justice that we'll want to come to a little bit later in the conversation.
Right. So trying to understand that colonial context, you really need a way of understanding it. And so for me, it's become very important to dig deep into what is this thing called colonialism? What is this thing called racism? What is this thing called sexism? What are the isms that we live with in this day, and to not be in denial that they are a part of our life. And so how do you start to undo those things? Well, you need a process of understanding. So I like the Iceberg model, and there's a group of us that we used to be known as Damascus Road, but now we're called Roots of Justice, and we're anti-oppression or dismantling oppression trainers. And so we use this concept of the iceberg. If you look above the waterline, mostly what people understand about icebergs is only what they see above the water. And really, that's only 10% of an iceberg. And the more dangerous part of the iceberg is actually what's underneath. It's the part that sinks ships, and at the very bottom, it's the part of the iceberg that drags along the ocean bottom and renders the ocean bottom sterile and it damages it for decades and decades. So this to me is what we need to do. We need to go deep. We need to figure out what is this iceberg. It's not just what we see above the water. It's not just what, as far as things like racism. It's not just what we see in the news and what we understand is racism. It has a much deeper structure to it. And so we have to understand the structure of racism and how it plays out institutionally and within society. And then we have to look at what has racism done to us, or what have any of the isms done to us personally, and what damage has it done to us, and how has it perverted our way of being in this world? How has it disrupted our balance? If you go back to the medicine wheel, how has it disrupted the way that we walk in this world in a way that's appropriate and helpful to all life? And so for me, this is a way of analyzing, and it's become very important for me to have this kind of understanding as I walk in this world. And it speaks to a restorative process too. Just like what I said earlier about a conflict. A conflict isn't that you see. It isn't just the explosion, or it isn't just the action that has brought you together. There's a much deeper structure to the conflict, a longer history. So we have to get below the water, put our faces in the water, and try to understand what's underneath. So that's why I like this picture.
Yeah, it's quite striking. Okay, now, for those of you listening, I remind you that we're going to have time for conversation, for questions and comments. So feel free anytime here to be typing them into Sarah, and she'll be collecting them here. Now, our topic today has to do with paradox. Let's look at the positive side of that paradox right now. When you look at the restorative justice field and the possible applications, what are the most positive or the most interesting applications of restorative justice for you?
Well, in my experience, I work with and deal with conflicts, conflict situations in the workplace and that kind of thing. But I also have the opportunity through my work with Mennonite Central Committee to actually look at root causes of the history of, especially between First Nations, Indigenous people, and more recent newcomers to this land, to try to figure out, what has the harm, or how does the history, the terrible history, play out. So one of those areas is the residential schools, they call them in Canada, Indian residential schools, and in the U.S. they're known as boarding schools, Indian boarding schools. So back in the 1800s, a process was put in place to attempt to assimilate Native American and First Nations people by focusing on the children, by taking children away from their communities, from their families, taking them often hundreds of miles away and schooling them. So these are young children, 5, 6, 7-year-old, and oftentimes they were kept at these schools until they were old enough to graduate, or they were much older anyway. And so it was an attempt to take what they call to kill the Indian but save the person, or save the man, as it was said back then. And it was an attempt to assimilate Native people into American or Canadian culture. What they're finding now is how much damage that has done, how much trauma and how much generational and intergenerational trauma this process has done to Native people, and it's probably touched every one of us as Indigenous people in some way or another. Oftentimes these schools were just not very good places, not very nice places. A lot of abuse happened in them. At times there were good things that happened. It was a place to be fed and that kind of thing, but it also focused on taking away what it means to be a Dakota or Anishinabe or Haida or what have you, and trying to instill oftentimes Christian values too. A lot of times, if not majority, it was Christian churches, denominations that partnered with government to have these schools put in place. And so and this went on for decades. So here in Canada now, after a lengthy court case, a Truth and Reconciliation Commission was put in place, and it's been going now for the last 5 years. And so what they do is they have gatherings both regionally and nationally, where there's opportunity for survivors of Indian residential schools and for former teachers and administrators of these schools to come forward and tell their story of what happened. And it's proven to be a very powerful experience. It's not perfect in any way, but it's a way of digging deep, and it's a way of expressing the story, like in that emotional realm, expressing the damage that has been done and the hurt that it's caused. But then it's also an opportunity to go deep and actually work at coming together. And it's designed for all Canadians to take part. It's taken a while for non-Indigenous people to realize that, but I would say in the last year or so, or a couple of years, more and more non-Indigenous Canadians are coming out to these events and experiencing and learning what, this whole chapter in the Canadian history that many people still don't even know about to this day. It always amazes me of how many people don't know about this part of Canadian history. So that's one example that I see of going deep, of trying to get at root causes of some of the issues that face Indigenous and non-Indigenous Canadians. So another one is the Doctrine of Discovery. I don't know how familiar you folks are with the Doctrine of Discovery, but basically it's the legal and moral apparatus. You can call it international law if you want, but it was put in place in the 1400s that basically allowed for colonization to happen. The Catholic Church, the Pope put in place what they call papal bulls that allowed for and actually divvied up the world according to giving the Spanish a certain area that they could exploit or explore and take the resources from, or the Portuguese, the European monarchies of the day were given the moral and legal structure that allowed for colonization to happen. And it's still being used to this day. I think it was just around October 15th of this year where the Six Nations in the U.S. Were trying to gain access to traditional land, and they were denied that in the U.S. Supreme Courts based on the Doctrine of Discovery. And it's been used over and over again to allow for colonial entities or the United States to have power over the land that was formerly held by Indigenous nations. So what I'm seeing now is that many Christian denominations, because a lot of Christian groups recognize that they are part of that history too, because of being Christian entities, they've taken some responsibility and have started to make statements of refuting this Doctrine of Discovery. But I've been involved in a process that has focused on the World Council of Churches, which represents 355 million Christians worldwide, to make a statement, and now in more recent days to actually put some programming behind that statement. So it's not just about making a statement. And so I really see that as another way of getting at the root cause of the issues that are before us. And that, to me, is a restorative process that we have to start undoing some of these legal and moral structures that are in place and that are hundreds of years old. We have to start figuring out a way of confronting them and changing them. And this is just one way that I've been involved in trying to go deep and address root causes. And then what I'm seeing, too, is I don't know if you folks on this call have heard of something called cultural competency. And a lot of times, from my understanding of cultural competency over the years, was to try to build an understanding of the culture that you were going to go work with, to try to understand how it functions, some of the dynamics of that culture. But what I'm seeing now is that a lot of groups are recognizing that you kind of have to do a 180 about face and start looking at your own culture first and figure out, what is it that we carry as we go into these places. And so cultural competency now, especially here in Canada, is about understanding the colonial history and narrative of Canada. So that you can understand better the perspective of Indigenous people. Because oftentimes we see that history, we recognize that there's this long history that's still with us to this day. But so many times we get helping agencies come in that don't understand that or don't even realize that which they represent. And so I'm starting to see now that many agencies are wanting to know that history better, so that they have a better lay of the land and have more perspectives on what they're dealing with.
So restorative justice is sometimes criticized for being too individualized, focusing too much on individual wrongs and conflicts and not looking at root causes. And I see that the parts of applications you're picking up are those that are much broader and much deeper than that.
Right.
So we're going to talk a little bit about what you see as promising practices. Now let's talk a little bit about the paradox side. I know that many First Nation people have kind of ambivalent about this term, restorative justice.
Right.
Do you feel that? Is that part of where the paradox comes in for you?
Yeah, absolutely. Especially when I first started working with restorative justice, I certainly saw the paradox in. Let me tell it this way in a story, and this was something that I experienced. I was in a workshop where some folks were doing a presentation on restorative justice, and they were presenting to mostly Indigenous groups, Indigenous people, and they were basically saying, here's something good for your community. And and I think this was like the Justice Department was doing this presentation and saying, here's something that's really good for your community, and it's yours. It's something that you can be proud of because it comes from your from you, from your culture. And an elder stood up, and he was perturbed. He was not very happy, and he said, this is really frustrating because it's like you stole our watch. Now you're trying to tell us what time it is. And so he was voicing and articulating that sentiment that, so much destruction has happened, and so many unhealthy cycles that were started by colonialism are still alive and well in our communities. And all you're doing as a dominant society is coming in and telling us how we should solve them, and not recognizing your own piece in all of that and who you represent as the dominant society. And if we really want a restorative process, then you're going to have to recognize that and start working on your own story and your own history and your own piece in that history. So I think and that was my frustration years ago when I started with restorative justice, was that it seemed like there wasn't a desire to learn about that history, or to recognize that there was things like sexism, for male facilitators. If, in my opinion and my experience, if you don't recognize those kinds of dynamics, then you can end up doing a lot more damage when you're in a process, a restorative process. And so and again, I say that it makes you a better facilitator if you can try to embrace those kinds of understandings and do your own work on your own self before going in as a facilitator. So, but the paradox, I like that word paradox. And I often tell this story that the first time that I started to embrace that understanding was actually, I don't think it had anything to do with a restorative setting. In fact, it was on Pine Ridge Reservation, sitting in my kitchen, or my wife and I, our house in our kitchen, and a friend came over, and we were just sitting around having coffee, and I don't even remember what we were talking about, but he made this statement that just stuck with me. He said, well, we're all walking contradictions anyway. And I started to think about that, and I thought, yeah, you're right. We are. We say we're about one thing, but we do something else. And we want to be one thing, but we find it really hard, and we end up doing something else. And I found a sense of relief in that statement. I kind of relaxed and thought, yeah, that's so true. And what's wrong with that? Let me just say, yeah, I am a contradiction. So since then, I've expanded that to the paradox. And so I want to say that, if you look back to that picture that I put up about the ledger art, it's not either or. It's not like for me, myself, that I'm just about the painting on the front. I've also been influenced by colonialism. I've been taught how to incorporate colonial ways which are harmful. And I have to start undoing those things. So I'm a walking paradox myself. And I have to figure out that I'm not just either or, I'm both and. And so that's the way that I think about the paradox of being a restorative justice practitioner, that I carry that paradox within me and within my experience of this work. And there's actually strength, I think, in that paradox, because as you begin to embrace that paradox, you also learn to see things from different perspectives, and that allows you to be in settings where you're dealing with conflict and you're dealing with a highly emotional or situation. It allows you to see things from different perspectives, at least a little bit. And it helps you to understand things and not be triggered as quickly, so that you can remain with people as they walk through, a difficult process.
Yeah, that makes a lot of sense. I've always felt like if you want to be a restorative justice practitioner, you have to learn to live as well in a context of paradox and ambiguity, because things just don't fit together. Life just doesn't all fit together nicely.
Yeah, and I would say that was the other reason for talking about paradox, was that oftentimes the way that restorative justice was presented to, First Nations groups and communities, any kind of community, was as a program. Here's a good program for your community or for you. When from an Indigenous understanding, I mean, when we worked on Pine Ridge Reservation and we did a lot of restorative processes and talking about it, one thing I always asked the Oglala Lakota people was, what's a name? What's an appropriate Lakota name for this process? And we never came up with one. And I believe it was because there was no name for just something that you did based on your way of life. It just happened, and you didn't have to call on a program to come in and help you with conflict, because it was understood that conflict was a part of life, and you dealt with it by the same way that you dealt with life together, and trying to look at it from all perspectives, and sitting down and thinking carefully about the situation, bringing in as many voices as you can that are connected to this story, and then making a decision after going through all of that. So there was no specific name for it. And I think that was part of my frustration too, was that it was being presented as a program that you could just bring out when it was needed, when what Indigenous people were telling us and saying was that it's a part of a way of life. And I think that's something that we have to restore in the larger context of our society and where we live in this world, because I think probably everybody can agree that our Western or our colonial way of life has been so damaging on so many different levels that we really do need to restore a different way of walking in this world.
Well, I've always felt that at best, restorative justice is an invitation to a dialogue. It's saying, here are some principles, here are some values. What resonates for you? What fits with your tradition? What doesn't fit with your tradition? What can we learn from each other? Does that resonate for you as well?
Oh yeah, absolutely. I think I know oftentimes when I'm talking about my perspective and my cultural understandings, so many times somebody from across the globe will say, that's just like us. We had that same understanding. And I know because my partner is Mennonite, we often talk about those kinds of things, those kinds of similarities in worldview. And sadly, that there's a need to return to those worldviews because we've gotten so far away from those worldviews too. So yeah.
Well, we all have our cultural and other kinds of blinders that are shaped by our biographies, and I worry so much that, for instance, the way I articulate restorative justice, how much of that is grounded in my Western, male European kind of background and the language we use, the framework, and so forth, and how to get beyond that. And a real challenge, I think.
Yeah.
Well, what would you say to those, if you're speaking to mainstream restorative justice practitioners, many of whom are European, Canadians, and American, what do you want us to live here? What do you want us to learn?
I think I would want practitioners to understand that this is about a way of life, and that we have to figure out how and put our energy, not only into raising money for programs and trying to, initiate programs in the various institutions that we find ourselves, but this also has to be done at a family level. It has to be, worked at between partners and with our children, because I think that's where a return to a natural way of being means that you practice something at every level, and it's, the values don't just work for one aspect of your life; they work for all aspects of your life. And I think that that's what we need to understand, that if we're not looking after every aspect of our life and only focusing on our work setting, even if it means that we're working hard on putting restorative justice into our work setting, if we're neglecting the other areas of our life, then the progress will be a lot slower. Yeah.
Just today, I was reading a chapter in a new book by Jerry Johnstone in the UK, and Jerry's, I think, one of the best observers of the field, and keeps his tabs on it. And he was commenting that he's noticing in the field more and more talk about conferencing, that particular model, and less about philosophy and the values. More and more restorative justice gets equated with a conferencing model of some sort. So that sort of goes along with what you're saying here, I think.
Yeah.
Let's go on and talk a bit about historical trauma. I know that that's something that's impacted your community. It's impacted all of us, and I think we both believe restorative justice has something to say to that. So let's talk about that a little bit.
Well, there's no question that restorative processes work, right? And they're very helpful for people to heal and to change their ways. And I think it's important to understand the dynamics of why these things happen. And from my opinion, and from looking at the history of my people, I started to realize that we've been so impacted and we've been so traumatized without the opportunity to heal, to grieve, to deal with trauma appropriately, that it's had lasting effects, and I think profound effects on our lives. And so I think it's really important to understand that. It's really important to understand trauma and historical trauma, because I think we're using processes within the restorative world that are helpful for actually healing and getting moving beyond some of these historical harms. And if you don't understand that, then I think we're missing an opportunity to actually work at healing in a really profound way. I mean, for me, I use the circle a lot. And the circle, I think, is a way of stimulating not only the dialogue, the conversation, and going deep, but it also has a way of stimulating the brain. And that's where a lot of trauma is held, right? If it's unresolved, it's often held in one side of the brain. And the way you heal from it is you try to integrate it. You try to get the brain to realize that trauma. Well, let me go back just a step. That when people are suffering from historical trauma, it means that trauma is trapped on one side of their brain. So anytime they're reminded or triggered by that trauma, the chemicals and the way that your body reacts just like you were experiencing that trauma again. And so that's why you get people that go into shock, or they freeze, or what have you, because their body is experiencing that trauma. So the way you heal from it is to integrate that, so that the other side of the brain can begin to reason and to say, okay, I'm being triggered, but that doesn't mean that the trauma is actually happening. So it's okay. So I can remain calm, and I can remain focused on the situation. And that's what healing is. It's about being able to have your body, your brain understand that you're not experiencing it again. And from an Indigenous perspective, centuries ago, and in our teachings and in our culture, we've had ways of dealing with trauma. We understood that something happens when you deal with trauma, and you have to go through a healing process in order to be, restored to your community, or to be a functional, helpful part of your community once again. So we developed ways, and oftentimes they were based on, song or singing or a physical way of dealing with that trauma. And so it was a way of incorporating that trauma into your life, but by using both sides of your brain, so that you began to be healed. And it was appropriately placed within your life experience, and it wasn't something that controlled your life any longer. And so I think it's really important that we understand that. And in fact, I would say that a lot of our conflicts are a result of unresolved trauma, that we haven't learned how to deal with life in a good way. We've learned how to be survivors. So we've learned how to protect ourselves, and we've learned how to protect our own, but we're not learning how to be a community as well. If we're all survivors of unresolved trauma, then we can't be nurturing to one another and be open to one another. So that's why I think it's really important that we understand trauma and work at healing as we work on restorative processes.
It's trauma really helps us understand the connection between the past and the present, doesn't it? I mean, I remember talking to the Maori judge who was overseeing the land tribunals in New Zealand, which are a bit like the Truth and Reconciliation Commission. And we were both saying the difficulty of having people understand what's the connection between these traumas that these events that people experienced in the past and the present. And we both agreed it's an understanding of historical trauma. We think it starts to make sense out of it. I noticed you talk about the implications for participants and clients on the slide. Can you talk more about that?
Yeah, I think I did with as far as for practitioners, to understand oftentimes where sometimes when you're working in a conflict situation as a practitioner, as a facilitator, things seemingly come from out of the blue. You don't know where that comment came from, or why are they taking that action now, or why are they shutting down. And if you have an understanding of trauma, because in my experience and my belief is that oftentimes those things from left field and people shutting down are about unresolved trauma. And so if you don't understand that, then either you're missing an opportunity or you won't know how to respond to that, and then you can even further the trauma experience or the triggering. You can make it worse, basically, if you don't understand. But if you have an understanding, then you can do things to help to alleviate that. Like take a break and take that person aside and just help them kind of work through that, and then come back, and then you're kind of ready to go again. And for people who are involved in restorative processes, for clients, I think if you can help to make the connection for people and point them towards healing processes, then I think that will even further or even strengthen the desire for this not happening again. So yeah, and I think if I guess I can't just say strongly enough that I really feel that trauma is such a big part, or unresolved trauma is such a big part of all of our lives, that not understanding it, we're missing opportunities, and we're missing ways of designing our programs that are helpful in addressing trauma. And I want to make that point that this isn't just about Indigenous communities. In looking at the whole history of colonialism, I mean, it's, as an Indigenous person, it can get you pretty worked up. When you look at all of the damage that's been done, and all of the life that has been lost, and ways of life that have been lost over the years, as an Indigenous person, if it can make you quite bitter. And so for me, I really needed to understand, why did this happen? And I because oftentimes you hear it happened because the Europeans came, but that's not a good enough answer. Why? What were some of why did this happen? What went on in the life of European people back then that allowed for this to happen? So it's not trying to say that there's something wrong with European ways of life, but something must have happened that allowed for this for them to be able to do this to other human beings all over the world. And so I would say, and I'm often careful how I say this, that the European experience has had colonialism and oppression as a historically a lot longer than my people have had it. So Europeans, descendants of European people experienced colonialism many centuries before my people did. And I believe that it went unresolved. And so as European people came out of their oppression, because, I mean, that's where I talked about the Doctrine of Discovery. For many centuries, the European nations were under the thumb of the Holy Roman Empire and the Catholic Church. For centuries, they were the oppressed. But as they slowly began to rise in power, then they became the powerful ones, and then they began to expand. But I think they did without having their trauma resolved. And so the cycle continued, right? It started a cycle of survivalists. And that's how I think colonialism continued to happen over here, is that we encountered, as an indigenous person, we encountered a group of people that had unresolved trauma in their history, and set up this cycle of it happening over again.
I think we're learning from this field called perpetrator induced trauma. That is, that studies are starting to show that people who perpetrate violence are also traumatized. And if that's true, that may be carried historically too. And so those of us whose ancestors may have been perpetrators may also carry a kind of trauma from that.
Right. Yeah, very similar.
We got a few questions here. Could we go into the discussion here a little bit, or do you have something else you want to say before we do that?
I think maybe I'll just say this one last thing, and maybe this is what I would also say to practitioners and those that are studying to be practitioners, is that really I think that what we're trying to restore in restorative processes are the values that all of us as human beings hope to achieve and hope to have at work in our lives. So, very basic values like humility and respect and integrity, generosity, courage, compassion, and fortitude. For me, those are kind of the foundational values, and that doesn't mean that they're just held by my culture. They are something that all of us want as human beings. And I think that's what, for me, this using restorative processes is trying to do, is trying to restore those values and seeing how they should be used in every aspect of our lives. So I think that's the last thought I wanted to say.
All right. Well, we have a couple of questions, and a couple of them here really are more about your personal faith journey. One of them is, how did you grow to separate colonization by Christians from Christianity itself? How can you practice a faith that is at its core part of the cultural identity of the colonizers? And it says, ask with gratitude for your sharing today.
Yeah, that's I had to go through a process of I guess trying to figure that out, because and it goes back to that ledger art picture. I think there were times in my life when I would have just rather separated completely from anything that was related to Christianity, because I saw the damage that the Christianity has done to my communities and to my people. But if I started to look at it a little more carefully, and because I'm in a loving relationship with my partner, with my wife, who is from that, carries that identity very strongly in her, in who she is. I had to figure out how to work with that, and it kind of is very similar to who I am as a man, because I recognize that I was raised in a very sexist society. And I recognize that consequently has made me a sexist person, and that doesn't mean that there's nothing I can do about it. There's a whole lot that I can do about it, and I'm trying to do those kinds of things in my life to remedy the sexism that I carry. And so, but I don't want I'm glad that my wife has left, because Harley is a sexist. She hasn't. She's chosen to walk with me in spite of what I carry that's been instilled in me in this sexist society. And so it's kind of the similar thing for me, is that there's a huge responsibility that Christians carry to undo the colonial history. And we need to walk together to do that. And I have to recognize that I've been influenced by that too. And so there's things that I have to undo in my life. And that to me is a restorative process. It's about looking at the patterns that are in place and trying to change those patterns. And I think we can only do that together. So that to me is how I think about that whole aspect. And what I'm learning too is that, if I think about traditional Native people who still try to carry and walk in the traditional ways, and then I think about somebody that I consider to be an authentic Christian, I see so many similarities. In fact, I see a lot more similarities than I see difference. But I'm talking about people who are very authentic in who they are at a core level, not the trappings of who they are, of the culture or of Christianity, but who they are at that core level. And I see more similarities than difference.
We'd be happy for some more questions. So while we're talking here, send some more into Sarah. Another one is related to that and says you work for an Anabaptist agency, Mennonite Central Committee. Are there any particularly powerful aspects of the Mennonite Anabaptist tradition that are helpful resources in working with other Christians?
I don't know if I understand Anabaptism enough to see that any of the particulars of Anabaptism to answer that question. I'm not sure if those people that I value within the Mennonite and Anabaptist world that I've walked with and that I'm working with. I'm not sure if it's because of Anabaptism or if it's because of their connection to their striving to understand the history of who they are, of trying to understand of where they are now in the society and what that means to them in what they carry. So I'm not sure if I'm answering the question, appropriately because it's hard for me to say that because I think what I strive to do is see beyond whether you're Anabaptist or Anglican or Episcopal or Dakota or Ojibwe or Haida or whatever it is that we the labels that we put on ourselves or that are put on us by society and try to see what's underneath that.
So this person is asking a follow-up question, not necessarily asking about Anabaptists in a theoretical sense, but just with the experience of flesh and blood Anabaptist folks. And he says, that's where I think, or she says, that's where I think you're going with what it said. So maybe you don't need to say more about that. You would think that Anabaptists, with their focus on nonviolence and experience of being a minority and that kind of thing, would have some particular resonance. But on the other hand, we've often been oppressors too. So the paradox, another paradox.
Yeah.
Here's a question that's specific to the U.S., but I think we could probably ask the same thing in the Canadian context. In the U.S. context, the Department of Justice has intersected some with Native American communities here. Has the Department of Justice in the U.S. begun to learn from elders or others how to better communicate with Indigenous communities? Do you feel like do you know enough about the Department of Justice in the United States to know whether it's learning something about that?
I think in my experience of working with Native communities in the U.S. and the Department of Justice, I would say just about like any other agency, there are people within it that get it, right? And they understand these dynamics and they understand where they need to go to seek authentic or appropriate guidance. But I would say the majority don't. And that has to do with the patterns of an agency. If it's hierarchical in nature, if it's set up in such a way that it has more concern about money, those kinds of things, then then it's not so much about the Department of Justice. It's more so about the people within it. So yeah, so it's really hard to say if I think there has to be a lot of undoing of patterns of not just in agencies like the Department of Justice, but within our church denominations, within our church agencies. I think we've come to rely on patterns that are more about hierarchy and power, or even not understanding power, or denying that there's power in positions within those kind of hierarchies. I find that happens a lot, that people don't want to acknowledge that they have power within almost any setting. But I think we have to understand that power so that we can use it appropriately and work, have that power be with people and not over people. Let me just tell a little story, and I'm not sure if this will answer the question, but it's a story that I like, so I'll tell it. Several years ago, maybe about 8 years ago, my colleague and I, Ruth Yellowhawk, we were invited to a tribal judges symposium, and this was sponsored by the Department of Justice in the U.S. And the people they were gathering were Indigenous judges. They were from the communities. And when we got there, it was a one-day setting, and I noticed that these mostly men were quite distant. It was almost like they didn't want to be there. And the Department of Justice kind of did their thing. There was some business that they needed to take care of, and then they introduced Ruth and I, and really in a real Western kind of way, they introduced us. But what we did was, when we got up in front of them, is that we introduced ourselves in a way that was appropriate to who we were as Indigenous people. So we kind of went through who we're related to and how we're connected and all that kind of thing. And as we did that, I saw their heads come up, because before that it was almost like they weren't even listening to us. It was almost like they didn't really want to listen, because here's yet some other people going to talk to us that have been provided by the Department of Justice. They didn't ask us if they wanted us to come in. They just did it. So I noticed their heads coming up and kind of checking us out a little bit. And then we stopped for coffee. And at the coffee break, one of the judges came up to me and he said, "Can we start again when we come back after coffee? Because we didn't start appropriately." So I just said, "Sure, yeah, that'd be fine." And so when we came back, they started with a traditional way of welcoming us, and a traditional way of praying, and a traditional way of them taking time to introduce themselves to us. And then, so that in itself was profound, right? But then when we started talking about some of these root cause issues like colonialism and that, they kind of turned on the Department of Justice people and started confronting them with the patterns that they were upset with, of always being told of how to do things, of not paying attention to the things that they wanted to pay attention to. So it was a very rich day that surfaced a lot of issues that they had problems with. I would have to say it wasn't such a wonderful day for the Department of Justice staff, because they were kind of put on the spot and called to the carpet. But it was an example of changing the patterns and changing the way of doing things. And my hope is that that departments like the Department of Justice would start doing that a lot more, of taking the risk of having the courage of actually hearing what's really on the minds of Indigenous people.
Got a couple questions here. One of them is, what avenues are most often presented to you to work within a First Nations / Native community in the context of restorative justice?
Oh.
Does that make sense?
Yeah. I would have to say, in my experience, it's around the issue of racism. And most times when I go into communities that are dealing with this issue, most of the times it's through the funding and through the people that ask us to come in, or most often the agency that is kind of overseeing whatever department it is or whatever organization it is. And the way that it's often worded to us is that we have a little issue with racism, there's some discrimination going on, and we'd like to deal with it. But as we get into the community, we begin to hear from the Indigenous people, them saying, this is a huge issue, and we've been talking about this for years, and nothing's been done. And we've been asking for this for years. We've been asking for somebody like you to come into the community for years. And so you hear these different perspectives. So that's often what we are asked to come in to deal with is the issue of racism. But I also, when I first heard that question, the first thing that came to my mind was conflict. And that oftentimes that's how it's also worded, is that we're having a conflict around racism. But it's more so, it's worded around, like conflict is almost like the safe word to use, and racism is a difficult word to use. But in recent years, I've come to realize that it's no wonder that we have these conflict situations happening with Indigenous communities and where there's Indigenous folks in whatever setting it may be. And that's because we are living in a context of conflict, because the colonial history and the colonial context has never been dealt with. We're still living with it. We're still living with this 500-year-old conflict on this continent. And so until we start to deal with that and start to realize that, then we'll keep having these flare-ups, all across the land. But we really need to start getting at the root causes of these conflicts in order to change these patterns that allow for these eruptions to happen.
Well, I think there might be an important message in that for at least U.S. restorative justice practitioners. I don't think we've engaged enough with the issue of racism and how racism may be operating among us as practitioners, but also what restorative justice has to say to racism. I think that's something we need a lot of work on. Here's another question. How can we further engage or challenge non-Indigenous folks related to cultural appropriation in the restorative justice context?
Wow.
That makes sense? Yeah. Hard one.
Yeah, that's a question that I've heard for years, too, and often struggled with myself, mainly because, I think the short answer to that question is to not just use a cultural process or a cultural way, but if you told the whole story, if you told the background story to this culture, and if you explain the context of colonialism, forced assimilation, the whole history of the U.S. or Canada and the interaction with Indigenous people, if you told that story, or if you understood that story, I think folks would be less apt to try to use something that's a cultural practice, because I think then you would hear or understand better how that can be offensive to a lot of Indigenous groups, because you would get it, right? If you knew that whole story and if you embraced that whole story, then you would be less apt to say, okay, well, I'm just going to use your spiritual process here for this, for this restorative work. I think you would be less apt to do that.
And it seems to be kind of a fascination with First Nation, Native American culture, and people are just picking up little things of it and trying to use it for themselves. But that would...
It's also related to trauma, in my opinion, because how there's, I don't know if you're aware of how laughter, how humor can often be a mask for uncomfortableness.
Mm-hmm.
Sometimes, excessive giggling and laughing is about your body trying to make itself feel better because it's uncomfortable. Yeah. And that's often related to unresolved trauma. So I wonder sometimes, too, if that's what we're trying to do when practitioners will use a culturally appropriated process. It's trying to make themselves feel a little more comfortable because they're aware at some level of the history of harm and pain that goes along with when you bring Indigenous and non-Indigenous people together. So if you can just do a little bit of Native spirituality, then that'll make myself feel a little more comfortable. And I'm talking as if I was a non-Indigenous practitioner. That'll make me feel a little more comfortable in my interaction with these Indigenous people. So I wonder if that's a little bit about what makes the practitioner feel better.
Here's a question that's quite different. It says, are you familiar with wellness courts? Have you ever worked with wellness courts? Do you know anything about them?
I've heard a little bit about them. I know they're gaining momentum in the U.S. I haven't worked with them specifically. I've just talked with some people who are involved in them. So I wouldn't know enough about them.
I don't know much either. So we'll be starting to wrap up here in a little bit. And if anybody has another question or so, we can work one more in here or two. I do have a question. I've heard a lot of mixed stories about the effort to implement restorative justice in Canada in First Nation communities. And Canada has engaged with restorative justice on a national level much more than the U.S. has. But I've heard both negative and positive stories. I've heard a lot of stories of outsiders and non-Indigenous people coming in and saying, look, we got this great Indigenous process for you, which really came from Australia or somewhere else.
Right.
But are there positive stories of engaging around these issues in a way that really honors and builds on true Indigenous processes in communities?
You mentioned somebody when we first started this call. It was Rose Rollins. And that's somebody that I work with quite often nowadays, and we interact quite a bit. And she's an Indigenous person from the Yukon territories in northern Canada. And she is a person who, as Howard knows, back in the late 80s and early 1990s, was involved in the first ever kind of institutionalized circle process for dealing with crime in the Yukon that the courts up there agreed with and took part in. And so, in more recent years, Rose has been doing a lot of work around healing, also trying to look at this whole aspect of intergenerational trauma. And she's said in years past that she really feels that Indigenous communities, her Indigenous communities where she's from, should just take back the process of dealing with crime and harm in their communities. Because she said we have the wisdom and we have the processes to do this on ourselves or for ourselves. So we should be doing this for ourselves. And she's seen that in action around the residential school issue, where she's worked on quite a large process of working at healing from the effects of residential school. And she sees that she's seen the strength of when you empower people through, real healing, that then you start to be you start to realize that we can do this for ourselves. We don't need the help of the dominant society. We can do this for ourselves. So I find that and then if you think about movements like, say, the Idle No More movement, I find a lot more hope in those kinds of movements, because my understanding of restorative justice has grown so much from just being a program or something that we can do to deal with crime rates in our communities, to being about restoring that worldview that we're talking about. And so I think movements like Idle No More are, in my mind, a part of the restoring of that worldview. That's what the Idle No More movement is about. It's about the damage that the environment is taking on due to the Canadian government's way of thinking about the environment and partnering with resource companies. So I'm not sure if that answers your question at that specific level of restorative justice as a movement, but I see restorative justice as so much more than just that, kind of smaller aspect.
Well, it reminds me too, in New Zealand, one of the big controversies is the Maori are saying, let us handle our own.
Yeah.
You know, why does the government come in and have to impose its neo-colonial kind of ways on it? Let us handle our own. And that's the tension, because the government doesn't want to give up that kind of authority.
Yeah.
Well, I think we're getting to the point where we'll start wrapping up. Do you have anything else you'd like to say to us?
No, I just want to thank everybody for being a part of this call. Maybe if there was one thing that I could say, you know, I'm not sure if you folks have looked into this. There's a book called "The Pedagogy of the Oppressed," right? And it's quite a profound book, and there's been other books written by the author. But I started to look into the word pedagogy, and I quickly began to realize that that's referencing children. It's about how children learn, right? Pedagogy. And so in more recent years, I've been looking at andragogy, which is about how adults learn. And so there's a difference in how we learn. And I think that the restorative process for clients, if you will, for people who participate in these kinds of settings, I think it can speak to people of all ages, but I think it instills a different way of learning, because as you're engaged with this as a participant of one of the parties that's been harmed or has done the harm, you begin to take responsibility for yourself. And I think that has more to do with andragogy than pedagogy, because pedagogy is more about how do you tell this group of people how they should be, based on pedagogy. But andragogy is about taking an initiative on yourself. It's about recognizing that there's a problem that needs to be addressed. So anyway, I think that's the last thing that I want to say, is that we need to expand our understanding of how we restore patterns that are actually helpful for all of mankind, for the environment and all of those things, and take the responsibility for ourselves to start moving in that direction.
Well, and that's a new word for me, a new term. Thank you. Thanks for that.
All right.
Well, thank you so much for being with us today. It's been great. And for those of you listening, it will be available online if you want to tell your friends about it or listen to it again. I'm going to turn it over now to Sarah, who's going to talk about some of the other things available and the future webinars. So thank you, Harley.
You're welcome.
Okay, thank you. As Howard said earlier, this is the last webinar in our fall series, and we will be resuming again in January. The end of January, as you'll see there, January 29th, the power of connection, attachment theory, and the practice of restorative justice with Anne-Marie Early. And February, a critical conversation with the new Jim Crow with Jacqueline Roebuck-Sacco and guests. March 19th, Possibility or Pipe Dream, a restorative justice social movement with Dana Green and Carl Stauffer. And then April 23rd, RJ and the Arts with Jane Golden. And May 14th, RJ and Neuroscience with Cheryl Talley. And you can register for those below at the link and stay connected with other events from the Zehr Institute at that website. We also wanted to let you know about the Summer Peace Building Institute. Registration is now available at emu.edu/cjp/SPI. Two courses that would be of particular interest are the Restorative Justice courses, The Impact of Social Issues on Restorative Justice with Jacqueline Roebuck-Sacco and Carl Stauffer, as well as Restorative Justice, The Promise, The Challenge. And you can see the dates there. There are other additional SPI courses beyond just restorative justice specific, and this draws a very diverse group of international practitioners. So we encourage you to check that out. STAR trainings. STAR is another program sponsored by the Center for Justice and Peace Building, Strategies for Trauma Awareness and Resilience. You will see the dates there. Star Level 1 will be held in February here in Harrisonburg, Virginia, and another one the end of May and beginning of June in Harrisonburg during the Summer Peace Building Institute. If you are interested in Star Level 2, you will see that will be held the end of April, beginning of May, and again, you may register at that link below. And lastly, we wanted to highlight the Master's program here at the Center for Justice and Peace Building. This is where I am currently a student, and it is a very good program. We specialize in practice-based curriculum, and there are different focuses, our restorative justice being one of those areas of study. And so we encourage you to check that out, emu.edu/CJP. Thank you very much, and we hope you'll join us in January.
And thank you again for those of you who've attended, and thank you to Harley. Really good to see you again, and thank you, Sarah. So we hope you have a good weekend and a good Christmas, and we hope to see you back in January. And have a good evening.